Let's do this.
I'm sorry, but how can one possibly pay attention to a book with no pictures in it?
Well, we made it. Read Across America Day. I sort of downplayed this in the previous videos, but the NEA haven't even made the program Seuss branded since 2018. Their contract expired, and with the visibility of the Dr. Seuss reevaluation, it's been a simple call to say that the program is now more diverse. That's all well and good, but before we move on from the so-called modern-day Mother Goose, I think there's still one more lesson we can learn from the success of Dr. Seuss. And that lesson is the value of literary nonsense. Even if you don't really have much grasp of what literary nonsense really is, then you should know plenty about our modern obsession with lore. You can't go very far without a Marvel movie discussion or a video essay picking apart the most random of movies for explanations of their universe. But many movies, and indeed a lot of books, can't simply be explained by the literal events they describe, and trying to create a timeline and a universe for every story can often reveal a lot more about you recounting it. After all, people can only understand what they're already familiar with, right? Literary nonsense is, in essence, recreating the thought process of a child. It may not necessarily be aimed at kids, but because human childhood is expected to be universal, it's an easy way to deliver a message to children. Child development is not my specialty, but there's an instinctual set of truths that are fed by pop culture. A day's experience is more potent for a child, and their time awake is largely spent taking in their environment, roaming around, testing how things work, listening to people, learning words before they know what they really mean, and a child's brain has a lot to learn. That's why parenting is just as important for their minds as it is for their health. The things that you allow a child to witness and parrot will form the bedrock for their entire personality and their entire worldview. So by going down to that level and appealing to the looseness of language that you have as a child, things might just stick better. Of course, Dr. Seuss is just one example of that appeal. Even Ted had history to pull from. Without bogging ourselves down with the really early histories, going back to before there was even the English language, Lewis Carroll gets quite possibly the most credit for literary nonsense in English, and not without reason. Alice in Wonderland is now so entrenched in culture that references to it in pop culture are themselves starting to replace it. And not to discredit a century and a half of criticism, but there are a few relevant techniques that I'd like to bring up. First, English is a really porous language. The rest of the world is no stranger to absurdism and loanwords and such, but since English is already a sausage of influences, it's much easier to make nonsense through those channels. That's why Newspeak, the language from Orwell's 1984, is so terrifying, because it's fundamentally anti-nonsense, anti-creativity, anti-influence. So on the flip side, when Carroll writes some fake Anglo-Saxon poetry for a laugh, then throws in some portmanteaus and glorified Freudian slips and a few words that just sound good, you get Jabberwocky.
"'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave.
But second, he's constantly pulling from familiar things in the world. Playing cards, animals, plants, certain registers of speech, the types of people a girl like Alice might have encountered at least once in her life. After all, this was a story developed organically, with one man appealing to the imaginations of three sisters. That man, Charles Dodgson, aka Lewis Carroll, added a few crucial elements to the book for publication. His manuscript to the real Alice gave her the "it's all a dream" ending from the start, but he was still worried that the story was too dark. So he added a poem to preface the book, telling of that golden afternoon telling stories. It was his version of a framing device, another layer to the dream. Around a half-century later came a few changes. Off the back of Jules Verne's Voyage Extraordinaire, and of a new run of recurring characters like Sherlock Holmes, there was a burgeoning interest for not just explanations, but a sense of immersion and continuity. You could be immersed in a good standalone story, but if you were being offered a window into a new world, or to the life of a compelling character, that's a persistent itch. Enter L. Frank Baum, who after writing an episodic children's book called A New Wonderland, made a second book called The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. And although he'd attempt many times to create new worlds, the land of Oz captivated readers. In the introduction, he writes about how fairy tales are obsolete and that the modern child seeks only entertainment in the wonder tales and gladly dispenses with all disagreeable incident. The book focuses on Dorothy entering and leaving Oz, a real place, and wrapping her story up neatly as such. But the characters and world she left behind, readers wanted to see continued. So not only did Baum continue, but he shaped the means of expanding a fantasy world. But before we go too deep, let's compare it to the film, made over 30 years later, especially the choice to make Oz a dream. Since there's no continuity there, then analyzing the world becomes very different. It becomes a probing into Dorothy's psyche. A girl from Dust Bowl, Kansas, who's never seen a big city except maybe in illustrations, would have very little awareness of what one actually looks and feels like. She'd be more familiar with folk tales of witches and wizards, rough ideas of wild animals, and the occasional traveling huckster. She wouldn't really have an idea of what it means to kill anything besides a farm animal, and her impression of exotic people would likely come from the traveling circus. Despite the books also using a lot of wordplay and cultural reference points, making for quite impressive children's fantasy, too much ground was given to fan questions about the world, rather than what it means for the reader. Ironically, the movie with the fewest answers overshadowed the source material that answered the most.
And now, our host, Roald Dahl. How are you?
We should talk about Roald Dahl's career at some point, but there's something to be said about a British contemporary of Dr. Seuss, because Ted's books actually didn't take off in the UK for a long while. British post-war sensibilities offloaded nonsense to adult humor, made popular by satires like Beyond the Fringe, and those were responses to conservative austerity in the 40s and 50s. Dahl brought it back to children's literature by acknowledging the darkness that Baum minimized. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory exemplified it by having nonsense exuded by Willy Wonka to a jaded audience. If there's any attempt at lore, like with the African pigs, Oompa Loompas, that's what I meant, then it's only just enough to spark the imagination and to tease those expecting more. The original book and its first movie both have a simple story with a satisfying ending and relatable lessons. That would have been great enough on its own. But then Dahl wrote Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator. It's not too far off from a Dahl story as you'd expect, but there's a curious line being walked with it. Imagination still flows, but the story is really just about survival. It's a children's adventure story, complete with political intrigue, absurd math logic, and a billionaire continuing to troll everyone. There's no real way of knowing whether it would have been nearly as successful because Dahl banned its adaptation to spare it the Quaker Oats treatment, but it's an interesting attempt to balance a little bit of lore with the same imaginative spirit.
Dr. Seuss on the loose.
There are two Whovilles. More than two. Who knows what books which don't say which have humans or whos? The Kids in the Cat in the Hat? The Onceler? What is the Grinch? If he stole Christmas and then gained 2 hearts, then why is he invading on Halloween and grinching the cat?
Well, I'll be grinched.
Well, I'll be grinched.
Now, obviously I'm playing it up, but Dr. Seuss is not conducive to lore. His stories are all about lessons and fantasies and wishes. They are nonsense with purpose, and his legacy stands on that. But that's not to say that his characters can't come back or meet each other. Indeed, as early as Margot and Bartholomew Cubbins, Ted wasn't averse to bringing back his favorite characters. The main thing is that he doesn't even try to maintain continuity. His worlds can be average or whimsical or anything in between. Sometimes it's a kid imagining it all, sometimes it's a character or world coming to them. What really helped the adaptations were that most had a narration, explicitly calling back to their written origins, and even those that didn't still had dialogue in poetic meter.
The boys in the back room have figured out how. Just wait till you see what they've puttered up now.
Now, by the time that Ted started really bringing his work to television, comics and book series became the new vectors of lore. They were aimed much older than toddlers, though, so the discussion of nonsense doesn't really apply there. But there's one more work that does, at least in figuring out how nonsense can beget lore.
It's all a lot of simple tricks and nonsense.
Oh, George. This is probably the most familiar ground in this video and a departure from literature, but the story process that went into Star Wars invites a few threads of discussion on this topic. Star Wars is what happens when you blend several disparate flavors together into a mystery smoothie and then craft a more complicated smoothie with it. In the first movie especially, when just coming up with the names for things, Lucas went a different direction to pretty much everything he was inspired by. Rather than just constructing plausible languages, making puns, or just outright using English words for everything, George preferred to come up with names just for how weird they sound, and then reach out for what they could mean. As they're used in the film, he would pair a couple of his keywords with familiar English ones: Jedi Knight, Grand Moff, Lord Vader. There's still a lot of English, but his alien naming conventions set a precedent. It's just that the precedent was mainly in what became the extended universe. Even as the films lay dormant for a decade and a half, the literature carried on with this nonsense naming approach, using it to create a lore unlike any other, one that was largely sanctioned but functionally fanfiction. It came to the point that, like a comic book continuity, it had to be cleaned up for each new trilogy. Of course, lore or not, the films are made to imply a much bigger universe than is on screen, but works just as well without dwelling on it. The prequels, bad as they are about the characters and what they stand for, more than about the galaxy. The sequel trilogy, flawed as it is about inspiring a new generation. The alien races and planets of Star Wars are no more complicated on screen than a Seussian race of Whos or Sneetches or Zacks. These stories, when they're done with nonsense and heart, are all about what it means to grow up, to learn. That's why it's so common for these to start with an opening statement appealing directly to childhood, even for older fans. Because nonsense is ultimately a gateway into fantasy. You hear a funny word, find out what it means, and then it becomes part of your lexicon. You find things easier to explain by making reference to it. It becomes a way for you to communicate. From there, you only need ask one question. Wait, is that supposed to be an Arab? Thank you so much for watching, everyone. This has been such a great run of videos, and there's plenty more pop history where that came from. Please like, comment, share these videos around, and subscribe for more from me. Thank you.